By the afternoon of July 30th, 1864, General John McConnell and his force of 2,800 Confederates were now on the run. They successfully burned the Pennsylvania town of Chambersburg and escaped west upon the Loudon Road with the plans to turn south and cross the Potomac into more friendlier territory. The problem they faced was coming from their rear. A Union cavalry unit of around 2,500 soldiers commanded by General William Averell. This Union force just galloped fiercely through the flame-surrounded streets of the burning town, hell-bent on stopping the Southern force that just made over 2,000 Northern citizens homeless. As Averell's cavalrymen drove their terribly frightened horses through the tremendously hot inferno that which used to be a county seat, they understood what they sought to accomplish in their ride: to gain revenge for the loss of this northern town. As the flames died down in the burning town and the night began to creep upon the Cumberland Valley, Averell's Union cavalry was on the trail for McConnell's Confederate raiders. It was an easy trail to follow. All along what is now Route 30 was strewn clothing, dresses, boots, and other stolen merchandise that the raiders either couldn't carry or didn't want to be caught with. Also, many of the barns along the route were on fire as the Confederates continued to damage the North's breadbasket of the Cumberland Valley, which is very similar to how the Shenandoah Valley supports the Southern cause by providing food, and they were decimating this valley as well. So I'm at Stinger Hill Cemetery. This is just right next to Route 30, which is the route in which the Confederates took in order to head over towards McConnellsburg. And they went through Fort Loudon. Well, 2 Confederate raiders, according to the story that I have read, were caught looting a building here in Fort Loudon, and they were let out of town and shot by recently discharged veterans of the Union Army. One of these unknown Confederate soldiers is buried here at Stinger Hill Cemetery, and as you can see, this is his grave, and it says here he was killed July 30th, 1864, and his name, of course, is unknown. He's written as an unknown Confederate. After crossing the mountains that mark the border between Franklin and Fulton counties, the Confederates entered here in McConnellsburg, Pennsylvania between 3 and 5 p.m. Now, once entered into the town, they cut the telegraph lines and assaulted the telegraph office. Before the arrival of the Confederates, Thomas F. Sloan, the town's 15-year-old telegraph operator, hid a spare set of telegraph instruments in the local judge's office. The rebels never found this spare piece of equipment, but the remaining equipment that was located in the telegraph office was quickly destroyed by the rebels. Now in McConnellsburg here, McCausland asked for 2,600 rations to feed his troops, or he would burn this small town to the ground. The demand was not fully met, but McCausland's troops did get fed as they looted the town and the surrounding farms, which of course he allowed the town to be spared from fire. On the night of July 30th, 1864, the Confederates camped in and around McConnellsburg as Averell's Union cavalry spied on the position from the mountaintop nearby. McCausland and his men camped in and around the town as General Bradley Johnson and his officers and men camped 1 mile south of town at the John B. Patterson farm. Patterson's house sat about 300 feet west of this marker here that marks the location of the last bivouac of Confederate forces above the Mason and Dixon line. Now that farmhouse was set somewhere over in that direction. Johnson pitched his tent under a large tree behind the Patterson's barn, and he and his officers dined in Patterson's dining room, where Mrs. Patterson was ordered to prepare them food. That night, they dined on fried chicken, biscuits, and coffee. Because of the uninvited guests in their home and camped in their farm, only one of Patterson's chickens survived until morning. As the raiders rested, it was planned for Gilmore's Marylanders to move into Bedford in the morning, while the majority of McCausland's force would head south and try to go back across the Potomac. Now behind me here is a stone pillar. It used to house a plaque that was placed here, I believe, by the Daughters of the Confederacy. It was to honor and to mark the place before the Pennsylvania state took up the action to actually put a marker here, to mark the location of the last bivouac of the Confederacy above the Mason-Dixon line. It is to commemorate a retreat of these people and the actions, being good or bad, of people in history. Now, no matter what your stance is on slavery or the Southern cause or whatever, which obviously is bad, removing of monuments should not be allowed. This is to mark a location of history, not to commemorate the actions of people or the belief system of people. This is to mark an historical place. And by removing such monuments, history disappears. Early in the morning of July 31st, 1864, Averell's Union cavalry descended the mountain and began pushing McCausland's pickets outside of McConnellsburg. The Confederates abandoned the plan to send Gilmore to Bedford, and the whole force began to travel south to Hancock, Maryland, and to the Potomac River, with hopes to slip into West Virginia and away from the Union cavalry. Now at 8 a.m., with shots exchanged between the two groups resulting in several killed and wounded, Averell successfully forced McCausland to retreat south out of McConnellsburg. As the Confederates moved south to Hancock, Averell was approached by a young Thomas Sloan, who explained about the hidden telegraph equipment that he saved from the Confederate raiders. Averell had the telegraph lines repaired, and Sloan sent a message on the general's behalf to Cumberland, Maryland, requesting assistance in stopping McCausland in Hancock. By 1 p.m., McCausland's Confederates arrived here in Hancock, Maryland. Hancock was a Maryland town, but many of its citizens were known as Copperheads. Now, Copperhead was a term that meant a person who lived in the North but supported the Southern Rebellion during the American Civil War. Also, a large portion of McCausland's men were Marylanders. They were Maryland Confederates. Now, General Johnson was from Maryland, and so was Gilmore, which created a problem for McCausland in the form of a potential mutiny. Upon arriving here in Hancock, many Confederates fed their horses and themselves, but many looted stores in the canal town. Hancock was a small town of just about 700 people at the time, but it was a bustling one since it's set next to the busy C&O Canal, which is where I'm standing at right here, this ditch here. The C&O Canal was a main trade and transport line from Cumberland, Maryland to Washington, D.C. Many store owners lost thousands of dollars of goods, and several private-owned canal boats that would have went up and down this canal here were burned. In the chaos, a Maryland soldier defended a woman from a Confederate soldier from being robbed. The Marylander took a blow to the head in her defense. McCausland then announced a ransom of $30,000 and 5,000 cooked rations, or he would burn the town of Hancock, despite the town's southern leanings. This was too much for General Johnson, who argued that this was too much for the small town, especially for fellow Southern sympathizers and Johnson's fellow Marylanders. While arguing with his superior, Johnson ordered Gilmore to place guards at houses and businesses to prevent other Confederate soldiers from looting and burning the structures here in Hancock. The behavior of the two generals and their men showed how much the two groups differed in opinion, showing that disorder has struck the Confederate command. Just as mutiny was imminent, and as McCausland and Johnson was in mid-argument, they were interrupted by the arrival of Averell and his Union cavalry coming over the northeast hills. With the approaching fire of Averell meeting the Confederate rear guard around 5 p.m., McCausland had to make a decision. He had no time or cover to cross the Potomac here at Hancock, so he began to move his forces west towards Cumberland, Maryland, using Gilmore's Marylanders to cover his retreat. Gilmore and his Confederate Marylanders fought Averell's forces on the hills, then in the streets of Hancock. Averell's telegraph message from McConnellsburg paid off. Union forces sent an ironclad train from Cumberland up the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was located on the opposite shores of the Potomac River, which is just over there on that side of the river here. That train fired 2 shots at the Confederate forces here at Hancock across the river, providing just another reason to move west and for the Confederates to not attempt to cross the river here at Hancock. The rebels fired back using their cannon battery that they still had with them. One ball actually penetrated the engine's firebox and another hit the engine's smokestack. With this damage, the Union armored train quickly reversed and returned back to Cumberland. Covering the Confederate retreat, Gilmore suffered a slight wound, and his force suffered 15 casualties here in Hancock. Gilmore was one of the last Confederate cavalrymen to leave the town of Hancock. With a lack of sleep and a loss of 300 horses to exhaustion in his pursuit of McCausland from McConnellsburg to Hancock, Averell decided not to pursue the Confederates any further. McCausland planned to once again ransom and burn a town. This time, his target was Cumberland, Maryland, which was a Union stronghold that protected the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad hub that was located there. Before arriving at the town, McCausland arrived at Folk's Mill about 3 p.m. on August the 1st, one day after the events at Hancock and 2 days after burning Chambersburg in Pennsylvania. A force of Union greenhorns commanded by General Benjamin F. Kelly with 6 pieces of artillery met the Confederates with cannon fire at Folk's Mill. McCausland, who was unsure of the land around him, found it more strategic to duel with his own cannons. Union and Confederate cannons fired at each other until about 8 p.m. when McCausland withdrew and traveled southeast to Old Town, Maryland. The next day, McCausland's Confederate raiders prepared to cross the Potomac and into West Virginia at Old Town, Maryland. But first, they had to find a way across the C&O Canal that was located there. Just like here, the C&O Canal was flooded, and you somehow had to get 2,800 men, or roughly 2,800 men, and cannons and wagons and everything else that you had with you, and horses across this ditch. To McCausland's disadvantage, all the bridges across the canal ditch were burned by Union Colonel Israel Stowe. Now, Stowe and his regiment occupied the towpath and the strip of land between the waters of the canal ditch and the waters of the Potomac River, and his little group successfully held off McCausland's troops until McCausland's Virginians, desperate to return to their native soil, built a bridge across the canal ditch and assaulted Stowe's left flank. Now, Stowe's retreating men took cover in a blockhouse and an armored train on the West Virginian side of the river along the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. McCausland requested Stowe's surrender, which was accepted, and McCausland's men continued to Springfield, West Virginia, and rested until August 4th. On August 3rd, Averell received reinforcements here at Hancock. On August the 4th, Averell and his men mounted up and crossed the Potomac River here through Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, and went on to Springfield, West Virginia. Meanwhile, McCausland moved south to Romney, West Virginia. In Springfield, Averell learned that Confederate raiders that were just there not long ago were heading to Moorefield, West Virginia. Between Romney and Moorefield, McCausland camped with Johnston's brigade located on the north side of the south branch of the Potomac River. McCausland's brigade camped on the south side of the branch of the Potomac River. Both positions were strategic only to feed and rest their horses, not for protecting their men. McCausland was staying in Moorefield, miles away from his command. The night of August 6th, Averell's scouts were spying on the Confederate positions, planning a sneak attack. An advance Union guard dressed in Confederate gray snuck into the Confederate pickets and quickly captured Confederate guards that protected Johnston's brigade on the north side of the Potomac River. Early in the morning of August the 7th, Averell attacked Johnston's position, quickly capturing many Confederate raiders who were still asleep or just waking up. The Union cavalrymen scattered the confused and surprised rebels in and across the river with shouts of "Remember Chambersburg!" piercing the morning fog as gunfire echoed across the river. McCausland's brigade mounted a defense, wheeling around the remaining cannons and opened fire on Union troops charging across the river. One rebel recalled, "In 5 minutes, the water was blue with floating corpses." Despite McCausland's stand at the river, the Confederates were overrun by Union cavalry who pursued the scattering Confederate forces through Moorefield and south of town. The Confederate forces were so scattered that the pursuit became useless. Upon reviewing the Confederate camps, Union soldiers recovered loot that was taken from the citizens of Chambersburg, including large amounts of money that was robbed from homes and pockets of the people of the North. Confederate losses were 38 officers and 377 enlisted men captured, 13 killed and 60 wounded. Averell's Union cavalry losses were 11 killed, 18 wounded, and 13 captured. But the man that led the raiders, General John McCausland, he escaped. Averell successfully took revenge for the burning of Chambersburg and decimated the two best cavalry units Early had in the area in one single battle. The Battle of Moorefield greatly weakened General Early's cavalry forces in the Shenandoah Valley, which posed little resistance to Philip Sheridan later in the war. Brigadier General William Averell served under General Philip Sheridan until a disagreement with his superior resulted in him being relieved of duty, and a bit of depression resulted. He resigned from the military on May 18, 1865. Becoming an inventor, he patented an improved way to lay asphalt pavement. He died February 3, 1900, at the age of 67. The General John McCausland escaped capture in Moorefield and rejoined the Army of Northern Virginia, fighting for Robert E. Lee in the siege of Petersburg. McCausland escaped before Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, which marked the end of the American Civil War. But McCausland soon disbanded his cavalry unit soon afterwards and was allowed to return home to live a peaceful life. But in June of 1865, the U.S. War Department issued the following directive to Major General Winford Hancock. The President directs that you cause the rebel General McCausland to be arrested and held until application is made for his person by the civil authorities of Pennsylvania. McCausland fled to Canada to escape prosecution. He then went to England and Scotland to visit family, and then he went to France. He then joined the French Foreign Legion and served in Mexico. In Franklin County, Pennsylvania, indictments had been issued for his arrest, but McCausland was allowed to return to America in 1867 after receiving assurances from Grant that he would not be arrested. For the rest of his life, McCausland lived a reclusive existence in a house that looked like a fortress, possibly scared that someone was coming for revenge. Despite this, McCausland never admitted that he did anything wrong by burning Chambersburg, and he never regretted following his orders. He died at home on January 23rd, 1927, at the age of 90, making him the next to the last Confederate general to pass away. At his death, many northern newspapers reported the death of the Hun of Chambersburg. Thank you for watching this video. Please see my references in the description and give this video a like, or if you have anything to add, drop in a comment. Remember, these stories are ours, and it is our duty to keep these stories alive. See you next time as I explore what in the history.